All right, we're going to try to do this as gracefully as possible with the two of us at one podium. I've been charged with introducing Rose and also serving as her interlocutor today, so I will try to do that also as smoothly as possible, sharing this microphone. I think probably my earliest I'll start at the beginning. Rose was born in Baltimore. She holds degrees from Wellesley and Johns Hopkins. She's the author of 3 books of poetry. I think I first became aware of Rose probably reading the Vineyard Gazette when I was a young boy growing up here in the summer and seeing pictures of a very glamorous woman of the Down Island variety. And wondering who this was who was always in pictures laughing uproariously with Art Buchwald or other island celebrities. And anybody who knows Rose knows that she's an incredibly gracious and graceful person. I think her most notable feature is that I do not know another person with a greater thirst for life than Rose Styron. And hopefully we'll get to talk about how this book came together and how we worked on it together. But that's Rose in a very brief nutshell. I think she's going to do a little introduction of the book right now, and then we'll try to talk about it. And we're obviously happy to answer any questions about how this all came together.
Yeah, we should talk about how it came together. Maybe I should start with that. What do you think?
Yeah, please.
Because this is a book. Well, I'll read one paragraph, first paragraph of my introduction, then we'll talk about how it got together. Reading Bill's letters has been a journey of surprise for me. As the originals and copies of the 1,000+ handwritten missives began to arrive from friends, colleagues, librarians, children, and others to whom I had sent hopeful queries about the letter's existence, I opened them with excitement, but then, for a moment, might hesitate, feeling almost as if I were prying into a secret life. The life of a man I'd lived with and loved for 54 not uncomplicated years. The secret life wasn't a different or parallel life. It was our life, one committed to paper, privately, and hands-free now by a brilliant wordsmith with original thoughts and insights, with generous impulses and particular humor to particular persons he valued. Family, close friends from childhood through middle age, writers contemporary and aspiring, mentors, marine buddies, and neighbors and editors with whom he had deep connections over the years. What a gift to me. Suddenly, belatedly, I realized that half the endless hours I thought he was working on novels alone and lonely and sad and wanting to be somewhere at his desk, he was actually writing letters. And I had no idea. I'd never seen any of these letters. And it came to me afterwards that whenever he got stuck on his fiction, because some of his books, for instance, Sophie's Choice, took 7 years, and he got stuck often, he went from fiction to reality. And writing these letters was his reality. And it became a kind of new, wonderful reality for me when I realized that when I had been running around being a flibbertigibbet or a mom or a tennis player or off on my human rights or birding ventures, as you said, thirst for life, which still hasn't been quite satisfied, he was sitting still and recording that life and showing how much he loved the children he was always yelling at to keep quiet, how much he enjoyed the social life, dinner parties he would always beg me not to have, and our trips abroad with friends and other writers or on intellectual missions, which he always balked at and said he wouldn't do, and then thoroughly enjoyed. So it was a treat for me to collect these letters.
Rose, you want to tell everybody, this book sort of came out of another book that Bill's biographer Jim West put together of letters to Bill's father. What was the process of sort of encountering those and then thinking about doing this book? How did that process sort of take shape?
I did do the introduction to that book too, which I'm not going to read you, but it was a wonderful evocation of Bill's boyhood and adolescence, which I still wish I had been there to envision. They were wonderful, funny boyhood letters about fooling around and about worrying whether he was ever going to be a writer and thinking he would never be a success when he went to prep school at 14 because he didn't have any friends and he didn't know how to play basketball and all he wanted to do was write and he was getting a D in history, all of the things, and then going to the movies and fooling around. And it was such a treat to read these letters to his father, which I encountered at a slightly later date when Bill and I met in Rome, and I realized he got a letter from his father every week, and that was because he wrote his father every week. And it was quite an incredible relationship. So after reading all these young letters, I was interested to see what he might have written to his young and slightly older children. So I began to explore that. And then when I was packing up the house after Bill died and I knew I wanted to move to Martha's Vineyard, and after I had sent to Duke, where his archives are, all the unfinished pieces of manuscript of stories and novels that I found stashed away for 50, 40, 30, 20 years in the bottoms of closets or behind a fireplace or wherever he'd abandoned them. I collected those, sent them to Duke, and then in my daughter Polly's childhood bureau, I found, belatedly, about 100 letters he had saved, that he had received from his favorite people, mostly in the last couple of decades. And I was so moved by them and sent them off to the archives that then I wondered what he had written all these people. So I put out a call for them, and pretty soon our little mailbox on a country road in Connecticut looked like the Sorcerer's Apprentice of letters that were spilling out, and they came from everywhere falling on the road. And so I stacked them up, and by the time I had 1,500 letters, I said to his editor, Bob Loomis, who had been his longtime friend from Duke, their Duke days on through Random House, and who had persuaded me to do this book, I think we have enough now, don't you? And he said, oh my God, do you think this is 20 years ago? This is publishing now. We want one 500-page book, so go edit it. And then he abandoned me and retired. So that's where the book came from.
So Rose, Rose is also making it sound like all she did was wait by the mailbox. We both made many trips to archives, Library of Congress together. You were in Texas collecting. Oh, that's even better.
Does this work? Not yet. Okay.
Collecting this material. When these letters come in, they're in Bill's hand, and there are huge piles of them. What was the experience like when you actually started sort of diving in, whether it was letters from the 50s, letters from the 60s, 70s? What was that experience like?
That experience was that I was awfully glad you agreed to help me with the letters. Because Blake transcribed all of these handwritten letters, and he put them in chronological order, which was what Random House wanted. My idea had been to have two-way correspondence between Bill and his literary peers or his mentors or the young writers that he mentored. Anyway, thank heavens for Blake. He came along and agreed to help me, and he implied that he knew a lot more about the letters than I did because when he was 19, he was the postmaster at the tiny little West Chop post office which Bill walked by every single afternoon with one dog or another on his meditative walks before he started writing. And Blake can tell you about
Yeah, I would
that if
say
you want to.
my impression of Rose was from the newspaper was a very glamorous lady. My impression of Bill was of a grump. I used to sell him stamps. This was my summer job for 2 summers when I was 19 and 20. And invariably, he would be coming in to mail a package to Carlos Fuentes or a letter to Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I would look at these things and be like, what world do these people inhabit? And he would never say a word to me. It would be like, 44 cents. There you go. And I actually re-encountered Bill when I was in graduate school because of his 1967 novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner. And I got a fellowship to go to Duke and do research in his papers. And I found actually probably similar thing. Rose was probably sending some of the things I was looking at as I was there, which is all correspondence to Bill. Because that's what he was able to save. Bill is not like a lot of his peers, particularly Norman Mailer, in that he didn't save carbons of his own outgoing correspondence. So this was part of the mission that we sort of embarked on together in 2007, I think, was to find everything that was the other end of these conversations. And I sort of knew a lot about what was written to him, but we didn't really know what Bill had said back. So it might be fun to read one of those if you want to.
Why don't you start? There was one you liked.
Oh, this is something that Rose and I talked a lot about. I mean, one of the most amazing things about this experience for me is getting to most historians. I study people that have been dead for about 100 years most of the time, and you don't get to talk to them. If you are, you've probably got some problems. And it was really fun to be able to, we're reading a letter from 1952 describing a party in Rome, and Rose can say, oh, this is who was there, and this is what we did. I mean, you're thinking, like, this is unbelievable. This is sort of it's like a living source, a living fountain that's just right there. And Rose and I talked a lot about Bill's personality that comes through in these letters that obviously I certainly never encountered. Rose knew a lot better than I did. This is a letter that he wrote to a person whose first name we don't know. A guy named Mr. Bean. This is in 1967, so not the comedian. I am old-fashioned enough so that most of my faith still comes from the poetry and passion of the Bible, so that when I recall the words, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble, therefore will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. I am moved to a belief in the eternal, in which one's death is only a necessary part of the great design. Warmest regards, William Styron. And I read this and I didn't understand what was going on. And this is a fellow who wrote Bill because he was dying of cancer. And this is when Bill is just about to finish this very controversial novel about a slave rebellion in 1831. And he's taking the time out of his day to sit down and write this guy a reply. And this is something Rose and I were both I don't know if you probably weren't shocked as much as I was that he took the time to answer basically every piece of mail that he received.
I wasn't shocked about that at all.
Yeah.
Because he did a lot on the telephone also.
Mm-hmm.
And especially after he had his depression and wrote his book on Darkness Visible, and people called him. Sorry, this way?
I'm going to tilt this thing.
I don't know. How is that? Is that better? Okay. So he would get calls from people all the time who would say, thank you for writing that book. It helped me to understand my son or my mother or whatever who was having depression. And then they would ask Bill other questions, and Bill would talk to them for hours on the phone. And I remember twice that I overheard, he talked to one young man and one old man out of committing suicide, and by using the book. So I am not surprised. I just didn't know that he actually wrote the letters.
Right.
Also, because he had, that kind of generosity.
You want to read one?
Are you going to read the Loomis one?
No, you read this one. Rose. We were very lucky, obviously, to have access to Rose's family also, and these letters to Susanna to me are the most touching letters in the book. These are the ones that make my wife cry.
Oh, really?
Not this one particularly.
Not
but
this one in particular. Have you got one that makes you cry?
I'll try to find that one.
Anyway, our oldest daughter, Susanna, um, graduated from high school early and went off to Franklin College in Lugano when she was just turning 16. And Bill was very, very worried about her, didn't think she should go, but he uh, put up with it and wrote her constantly as a good father, telling her not to take glider lessons, not to, and to drive carefully, that sort of thing. So this is, because it's got a couple of Vineyard people in it, I'll read this one. Dear Sue, I'm writing this while you are undoubtedly in the depths of some Turkish opium den, and I hope the mails are fast enough so that this will reach you in Lugano around the time of your arrival. We received your itinerary of the trip through Greece and Turkey, and it sounds fabulous. She just now, 50 years later, has gone back to Greece and Turkey this month. She's just back. Also received your postcard with your description of an ouzo drinking bout below decks with the crew. You sure do get around for a gal of 16. Last night at the author's party at Tony Horowitz's, another writer, Steve Fisher, came up to Susanna and said, "The first time I ever had hash was at your parents' house in Roxbury, where I was taken by their mutual friend Nick Charles. So I listened to this episode last night and thought, boy, I sure didn't know what was going on when she was 15. Now she's 16. Your ma and I went to a preview of Neil Simon's new play, directed, of course, by Mike Nichols, and then, this was last night, went out with Mike for dinner. A fine time, really, but as usual, I'm getting more and more fed up with Fun City and can't wait to get back to the country. The play was funny enough, but instantly forgettable. Not at all like the drama of your pause, which is nearing completion. That is, I'm halfway through the second of 2 acts. This is a play he wrote for Bob Brustein, and there are many letters about the incidents that it came out of. The thing that's fun about these letters, aside from the humor and the diversity, are that you can see where each of his novel stories came from, because he writes about the incidents personally that he then developed into fiction. I'm writing, it's both sad and funny, this play I'm writing, and the best news I can send you so far is that Bob Brustein, of or than whom there is no finer judge in the world, listened to me read the first act not long ago and absolutely adored it, instantly offered to stage it at Yale, where no doubt it will be put on late this spring. Naturally, to get Bob's kind of professional reaction and to find it so wholeheartedly positive and favorable is an enormous boost to my morale, and I am proceeding in high spirits. Those high spirits didn't last through the evening, however, where it was the worst snowstorm we'd ever had in Connecticut, and the bus that was coming up from New York was quite late, and Bob was stuck in London. But there was a performance anyway. So Bill was always so in doubt about what he was going to do that I liked this letter because it was a positive one on a high note. And the letters to his father and often to his other literary friends like Peter Matheson or James Jones or Norman Mailer or Willie Morris were full of self-doubt. They were also full of wonderful, honest criticisms, which are all throughout the book, of their work and response to their criticisms of his work. So it makes for interesting reading, especially for a young writer, to see how hard the process was, but how much, at least this particular generation of writers who were very close friends, meant to each other, and how much they supported each other and were not competitive as writers are so often accused of being, but really were very supportive.
So, Rose, you were just talking about not being surprised by the sort of his answering sort of every letter. I'm just wondering, just to describe how this process worked. We had this huge stack of letters, and they were kind of coming in. We had them coming in right up until the end, right up until the book was coming out. I would spend the evening typing them up and beginning to notate them, and the next morning I'd drive over to Rose's in Vineyard Haven, and we'd spend 3 hours together reading through them. Sometimes just picking letters out. A lot of the time, Rose telling me, well, when this guy is referred to, this is who this refers to when it's a nickname or something like that. Was there stuff that did surprise you in the letters about Bill, or about, I mean, not just about the time he spent doing this, but...
I think I was surprised at his total honesty and the wonderful, often inappropriate or politically incorrect language that he used as humor with his personal friends. And every now and then I was quite shocked that he would say this about so-and-so, but it always ended up being funny and honest, and he was a pretty good judge of character. So, yeah. Or, I was just looking at this other letter to Susanna, where I think it's some months later, it's just before Christmas, and he is saying, the main thing is it's hard to believe you will be here very, very soon. She was coming home for Christmas. I am stunned by the notion that once again the hideous season of Christmas is upon us. If anybody read our daughter Alexandra's book, they will remember the hideous seasons of Christmas. But knowing that you will be here warms the cockles of my old heart, and if for no other reason than to please my darling daughter, I promise that on Christmas Day I will be nice, courteous, loving, trustworthy, jolly, outgoing, forbearing, sweet, tender, generous, affable, and a saint. We won't
I
go
mean,
into the rest of this.
there's that humor. I found this is the one my wife likes the most. This is Bill writing to Susanna much at the same time. This is in 1972. And the first paragraph, he opens talking to her about meeting with Daniel Ellsberg. I mean, it's a lot about what's going on in Bill's intellectual life. And then he says, as for your existential wrestling, I'm sure that I don't have to tell you that your pondering and wondering and troubling are only extensions of what people have been doing ever since they had the capability of thought, which is to say hundreds of thousands of years. Gods and the idea of God were, of course, born out of just this troubled pondering, so it may or may not be a consolation to you that your intense wonder and turmoil about the meaning of the human condition. This is a father writing to his 16-year-old daughter. This is why my wife always starts to cry. She's like, why didn't I have a parent like this? Your wondering about the meaning of the human condition is, in fact, a part of the human condition, or at least as it is experienced by sensitive and questing souls like yourself, no joke. It may just be that there is no reason or purpose to existence. This is heavy stuff. Many great men, thinkers, and artists have thought this to be true, yet have not despaired over this assumption, but have created great work through their very vision of mankind enduring, triumphant over the sheer purposelessness of the universe, and in spite of the bleak and soulless aspect it so often presents. The whole concept of tragedy is, of course, embodied in this notion. This goes on for 2,000 more words. I just think that it's just an extraordinary thing for a father to be writing to his teenage daughter in this way. Rose has picked out one that I think is the other side of this correspondence.
The other side of this it's to his great pal, Philip Roth, who I had the honor of discovering for the Paris Review for his first story. So Philip and I have remained good friends, and he and Bill started out together as friends. And so this is a letter he wrote to Philip on his 40th birthday, and it occurred to me to read it because I just went to Philip's 80th birthday party in Newark, which was never to be believed or duplicated. It was like planning your own funeral to be sure you could be there, and it all went right. They named a park for him in Newark, and he invited all his girlfriends from all over the world. I mean, including there was Edna O'Brien came from Ireland, and there was a philosopher from London, and I won't go on about it, but they all gave him beautiful tributes, and Philip was beaming the whole time. And Philip didn't often beam, I have to tell you. He was very downbeat or depressed or angry. He was also one of the funniest stand-up comics when he felt that way. But this was when he had been attacked by two critics, Norman Podhoretz and Irving Howe, who were quite famous critics at the time. And they wrote something called Philip Roth Reconsidered, which was totally negative. And he says, because he had often been attacked, "Dear Philip, I have not committed the cruelty of reading either Podhoretz or Howe more than once, but I do have some lingering impressions. As one who is no stranger to such all-out attacks, I think I can both analyze and judge the nature of this knee-in-the-groin criticism with possibly a little bit more familiarity than some writers." And he goes on to say why several other critics who gave him bad reviews, especially after Nat Turner, had their own agendas. One of them who had also given bad reviews in that recent time, not only to Philip, but to The Ship of Fools, to In Cold Blood, and then to Nat Turner. Anyway, I won't go into...
Yeah. You gotta have your good closing with that, though.
All right, I won't read the rest of it, but I will say that this is how he concluded. "Well, you're 40 now and old enough not to know you've just got to take such shit. Wait till you're 47. Boy, then you'll know what the wintry touch of mortality really feels like. Yours in the slime we sometimes find ourselves up to our asses in, Bill."
We'd love to answer any questions if you got them. Yeah. Oh. Microphone.
Thank you very much. I am interested in, I don't know, I missed what might have been an introduction. I'm interested in how you first met Bill and how got to know him and what that was like, if you're willing to talk about it a little. And you mentioned the Paris Review, and I'd be interested to hear you say a little about George Plimpton, if you would care to.
Okay.
Please.
First question. I met him when I was a student at Johns Hopkins. He had written his first novel, a bestseller called Lie Down in Darkness, and the very first place he had ever been invited to speak was to our classes, our writing classes at Johns Hopkins. We were all summoned there. I was with the intellectual poets and critics. We thought fiction was a level below what we should aspire to. And Bill Styron, who was the most nervous speaker you have ever heard, came up and impressed nobody. So, end of that scene, we all left. About a year and a half later, I am in Rome. And I get a letter from Louis Rubin, who was Bill's friend, who was my professor who'd invited him to Hopkins, saying, "Bill Styron is in Rome too. You both just got there. If you get to the American Academy in Rome, where he has a prix de Rome, and the first novelist to get one, look him up." I thought no more about it until I went on a very boring date to the American Academy in Rome, and as I was leaving, past the cubbies with the fellows' names on, and said, "Oh, Louis told me to look him up." And I wrote him a note, and he wrote me, he called me up like 3 hours later, pretended he remembered me, which of course he couldn't possibly have, and said, "Could you meet me in the downstairs little bar at the Hotel Excelsior tomorrow night?" And I said, sure. And
I have to interrupt very briefly to say this is how almost all of Rose's stories end with what's about to happen now. The Hotel Excelsior.
Oh, down the stairs, I'm thinking, will I remember what he looks like? I suppose there are lots of people there. How will I find him? So I go downstairs, and there are only 3 people there because it's a very tiny bar. And the person on the left is short with a lot of black curly hair. The person on the right is Truman Capote, who, who I am thrilled to meet because I've read his books, Other Voices, Other Rooms, and he looks just like the picture, except he isn't lying on his side. But,
He was on the bar.
he was on the bar. Anyway, and then in the middle is tall, slim, handsome Bill Styron, so I knew I had lucked out. And by the end of the evening, which was about 6 hours later, I heard Truman say Truman was also there because he had been told to look up Bill. And Bill had all 3 of us there so he would be protected because he didn't know what was coming. And I heard Truman say, Bill, you ought to marry that girl. That's the end of that story. I think you asked me a second one, but I can't remember what it was. Oh, about George Plimpton.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I met George Plimpton in Paris after Bill and I had been going together for a couple of months. And he took me to Paris to meet all his Paris Review friends. He had been there, in the months before we met, helping to start the Paris Review with George Plimpton, Peter Matheson, Tom Ginsberg, Billy Dubois, Doc Humes, the whole crowd. So I met them all, and I was very impressed with George, who seemed to me to have the best sense of humor and the most appetite for adventure. And Bill said, I can't believe he's American. When I met him, I thought he was British. He had such a weird accent. Anyway, George was very elegant and tons of fun. And I traveled all over the world with George, as I did with Peter Matheson, either with or without Bill, on all sorts of trips. And I could tell you lots of stories about all the stories he made up, which are now history.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.